Is for tonight. Thank you very much for coming. We have an hour and a half. William Binney will be speaking first, and then Carol Rose will be a discussant. She'll be speaking second, and then we'll be opening it up for discussion. So there'll be plenty of time. I've asked them to leave time at the end for discussion and questions and answers, so I want to assure you that there will be time for that. Let me introduce the speakers to you briefly. William Binney is on my left. He is a former employee of the National Security Agency. He served there. He was in public service for the United States and on behalf of us for almost 40 years. Bill rose through the ranks through the years, and eventually he was supervising a gigantic section of, he himself is a crypto mathematician, a gigantic section of technical people who were working on signals intelligence. And he was responsible for this group of, was it
About 6,000.
6,000 people who were working on signals intelligence. He developed several technologies himself, working by himself or with teams, and he'll tell you about some of those this evening. But he had a very long and distinguished career there. One of the technologies he developed, and again, the mission of NSA is signals intelligence, and by law they are to operate outside of the United States. So foreign operation regarding signals intelligence. And in fact, as Bill will tell you, there's something called UCIT 18, which he will probably refer to as their Bible, which forbids NSA to use those techniques on US citizens. Following the terrorist attack in 2001, provided the perfect opportunity for those who wished to begin spying on Americans, and that commenced. So since 2001, not only every telephone call, both the number called to and from, but the content of those calls, every email, tweet, idiotic text, ATM transaction, online purchase of airline tickets, all of the electronic transactions you've engaged in, and everyone else in the United States have been captured by the NSA and are being used by them, and Bill is going to be going into detail about that. Carol Rose is the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union here in Massachusetts, and she is a lawyer and a journalist. She was in private practice before becoming the head of the ACLU of Massachusetts. She has a long history working in the area of civil liberties and human rights, both in the United States and abroad, and she'll be functioning as the discussant tonight. As part of the Hall of Mirrors that I've described to you very briefly, I do want to tell you, because Bill Binney might not tell you, that he was so outraged by what happened after 2001 using the technologies that he had helped to create when they were turned on American citizens that he retired from the NSA after his almost 40 years. He took retirement. At one point, early one morning, there was a knock on the door of his suburban home, and a team of FBI agents ran into his home. I believe one of your sons answered the door, Bill, is that right?
Yep.
They ran into his home, dashed up the stairs, pulled Bill out of the shower, pointed a gun at him, harassed him for a while, and then left. They didn't charge him with anything. He hadn't done anything wrong, but it was just to make sure he got the message. Some years later, amazingly, Bill, out of the blue, received a letter from the Department of Justice informing him that he had committed no crime, that they were not going to charge him with a crime, and kind of exonerating him in general so that he could move forward in life and feel better about that. Would that we would all get letters from the Department of Justice like that. But Bill actually has one. I hope it's framed over your mantle or in your kitchen or something.
I still have it.
Yeah, I'm sure you still have it, Bill. Hang on to that. Laminate it, Bill. On that note, I'm going to give you Bill Binney, please.
Thanks. Thank you, and thank you for having me here. I always appreciate the opportunity to express my story, because I'm really going to tell you the story of how we got to a surveillance state that we currently have, and what the government's doing with this data, and how it's used to profile you. Even though they don't look at it, they still have this profile of everybody in the country. And I'll show you what that looks like. And I could do this because the lawyers at NSA approved us to go out and make a commercial product of the capabilities we were preparing inside. So what you're looking at is our commercial equivalent, okay? So you can get the idea of what can happen. But this all started in the early 90s. Dr. John Taggart, who worked in the research department of NSA, he was the staff chief there, and I got together, because I was from operations, he was from research. We got together and decided that we had to have a central group to do development of new capabilities in NSA. And it required that we bring all the talents together in one place so they could share in the effort, know exactly what they were building toward, and know what their part in it was. Otherwise, they were all just sitting in separate little bins, and nobody really knew what anybody else did at NSA. So they had independent efforts that didn't really come together. So we really weren't getting solutions to the problems that we really needed. So we called this center the SIGINT Automation Research Center. So John brought engineers and computer people and physicists, and I brought crypto mathematicians and traffic analysts and other kinds of data systems analysis and language. So we brought the operations together with research, had all those skills in one place, and defined the operation that we were trying to solve at one time, and then assigned everybody to a certain aspect of it, and they knew exactly what they had to do, and they all interactively worked together as the developments occurred. So we would incrementally see how it would improve and how we could jointly pull together those skills to make a success. So that meant we were doing rapid prototyping, incremental development, those kinds of spiral development kinds of things. So in the mid-90s, with the position I had in the Directorate of Operations, we were looking at the problems we had, and the one most prominent to us was the World Wide Web and the ballooning, mushrooming modern communication system. So we decided that that was the one we should attack. Specifically, we were still talking about only doing, our charter was only to foreign intelligence, and that's all we were interested in doing. So we started to attack that, putting together ways to first reassemble the data off the wires and fiber optic lines and things like that, and then assemble it as it goes by, assemble code that would monitor it, diagnose it, and select out of that flow of information that we wanted to pass off to individuals to analyze and report on. So that meant we were going to be looking at these flows of information to pull out what was important and just throw the rest of it away. In other words, anything that anybody was sending, like anybody in the United States, we would simply throw away, never see. That would never be collected. So we started doing that and approaching that and developing some, using graphing techniques to build relationships in that data, because we had a problem of how can you look into terabytes a minute of data. The objective we set was to try to do 20 terabytes a minute, be able to diagnose what was in 20 terabytes a minute and pull out what was important and throw the rest away. So we had to devise the ways to look at that and say, well, how can we do that? Well, if you looked at relationships between people or organizations, the attributes that are used to communicate information across the web with the IPs and user and service provider names and things like that, and also phone numbers with the public switch telephone network or the satellite network, all of that would be attributes that we could use then to graph or build a relationship, social network, if you will. Nowadays they call it social network. In the Civil War, they simply watched people visiting different people, and that's how they rebuilt the network for the Confederate spies in Washington. If you didn't know that, they watched people move around. Then in World War I, when Morris became the field communication system for the armies, they started doing network reconstruction of the field armies, and then that technique became contact chaining in World War II and afterward, and now it's called social networking. So there's a little history behind that. So this is nothing new, really. It's just the scale, because we wanted to do the entire world. And to us, that didn't pose a problem, because we were going to in order to interactively work with that data as it came down the line, make those selections, we had to keep everything as simple as we could, so we used B+3 indexing on flat files and simply did use that with our knowledge database graph, if you will, to make the selections and also make the throwaway determinations. So that was a fast way of doing it. That's exactly what we did, and it worked fairly well at fiber optic rates. I mean, for the arguments we had, we only had a few arguments running, but it was clear that we could scale to any number. So we didn't have any difficulty in pulling out all the bad guys with that approach. Plus, at the same time, we noticed that since we were collecting worldwide, we were scooping up Americans because the web will shoot your stuff all around, okay? So we could get it anywhere. So we kept picking up things that were easily identifiable by the numbering schemes in the IPv4, IPv6, the public switch telephone numbering schemes. All of those things would help us as a knowledge base to select out Americans and encrypt all of their attributes so that you couldn't tell who they were. That's the way we managed that. We thought that would be constitutionally acceptable, and that's what we forwarded to the Department of Justice as a proposal for us to proceed in doing this on a mass scale worldwide. We never really got any feedback from that. It was never passed into court, so we never saw the arguments coming out. And in fact, it's never gone to court yet. The Electronic Frontiers Foundation lawsuit is dealing with that, and that's where I signed an affidavit with them to help support that effort. And the point there is the collection of all this information about individuals is unconstitutional even to begin with, let alone to build graphs or any of that stuff with it. But we never got any feedback from the Department of Justice. All I got was a visit from the FBI to tell me to keep quiet, you know. So after we got that running, then I found out later that NSA had approached the telecommunications companies in February of 2001. This is 8 months before 9/11, asking for all the customer data, that is the billing data, on phone calls made by U.S. citizens to other U.S. citizens, in fact, their entire customer set. And that's fundamentally what they did after 9/11. But here they were asking 8 months before. And what that meant to me was that this was the design from the beginning, that management had made the plan to spy on the United States and the people in the United States even before 9/11. Okay, then when 9/11 occurred, that was the pure excuse for them to go in and say, okay, now telecoms, we really need the data now to be able to do this, protect the United States from terrorism. And that was simply false to begin with. We had no problem at all identifying these people from the beginning. That was absolutely false. But that was the pretext they used to get that process running. So the first input that I was aware of, they had to use the program that we set up because nothing else was prepared to be able to deal with massive amounts of data. Okay, so they used this program that we set up to do foreign intelligence. All right, they used it and turned it around on everybody in this country. It was simply another input, that's all. It was the same kind of data, just a different input. So the company that I knew was participating was AT&T. And they started by forwarding about roughly 320 million records of billing data of U.S. citizens to other U.S. citizens every day. And then CNET did a study in 2006. They asked the questions of all the telecoms as to who was participating with NSA, and are you giving them data, and so on. And by their answers, you could tell about 10 of them were. So my estimate was that over that period of time, and then with Mark Klein's disclosure about the NARIS devices and NSA rooms that they were creating in the AT&T facilities with the NARIS device, which is a sessionizer on the line. They'll do fiber optic rates at line speeds of 10 gigabits. That's the NARIS Insight device, which means it can sessionize about 100 plus billion 1,000 character emails a day. One device. So when they were doing that, then I had to change my estimates of the number of transactions they were collecting because now they had the input from the fiber lines. That's why they're building Bluffdale. They're getting too much data. They need more storage, okay? So my estimate now is that just for emails and phone calls alone, they have approaching 20 trillion transactions of U.S. citizens with other U.S. citizens, okay? Now that, I assume that simple transactions like banking and Twitter and all that are also included in that, and then that adds trillions of more transactions. So, but when you do that, and you start to assemble it against that kind of information against individuals, you're assembling power, and you can use that knowledge against anyone that you want. And give you an idea of how that works. First of all, they kept claiming this is how they got money to do all this to begin with. They claimed that volume, velocity, and variety were the problems that they were being buried with all this information. They couldn't figure it out. Well, when I looked at it, I thought, these are all positive things. Volume means you get more about your target. Velocity means you get it faster, and variety means you get some more aspects. You know, all that's positive. So the question was how to take advantage of it. Well, using graphing techniques and other things is the way we did it. And we put together systems that did this kind of thing, where the bottom here, this would be like a nearest device input into a validating system, which would validate information, because believe it or not, people still make typing errors in data. And you could see them. Customs and Border Protection has a lot of typing errors because they get inputs from different people around the world. They don't speak English, it's not their main language, so they type the wrong name or they abbreviate it a different way. And so they have many different versions, and what we wanted to do with that, and this is also true with the FBI, although they don't seem to care. But the point is, validating the data is so important up front, just like a crypt system. You can't start, the more valid and reliable the input on a crypt system, the better it is to attack it. And so the same here with data on a large scale. You need to validate it, then look into it, look at event recognition, and you use those to go against your graph to make a check as to whether or not you want that data or not. And then privacy protections. This was where we went through and looked to see if we should encrypt the attributes so that it could cover and apply privacy to that kind of communications. That is, no one could look at it and see or understand who it was. And then that's where, after that, then you build the graph. Then you take other graphs from other kinds of domains, like banking or if this is email, you could take phones and Twitter and travel and whatever else you can add electronically. Okay, and then build a consolidated mapping graph, so across all those domains. In our case, we wanted to do it with, this is an example of what we wanted to do. This was one that the DOJ made a conspiracy charge against us on. So we were trying to do, get together and form a coalition to attack Medicare and Medicaid fraud. We thought that would be meaningful. Certainly could save the government money, and we could make a little money, you know. So we thought that would be a good thing to do. So as a result of that, they drafted charges for conspiracy against us and used that to raid us. So that just goes to show you how much that's. But at any rate,
is it possible to kill the lights that are shining on the screen?
Sure.
Thank you.
Ah, okay. There we go. There we go. But the idea is, like, in this case, you could do it with agencies, or you could take inputs like this could be hospitals, doctors, labs, and individuals, and all their accounts and relationships like that, locations and things like that. And then build a multi-dimensional graph so you could start checking all this data against itself. The answers really are, from where we sit, the answers were always in the data. The question was, how could you get the answers out of that data? Okay, yes?
So sorry, I'm confused. So you said that that's something you proposed to do in the 90s, kind of as a...
Well, it came out of the 90s. We made this proposal for Medicare fraud in 2006.
But didn't you say that that was unconstitutional?
Not with the data we were working for Medicare and Medicaid. So that's all.
Because it comes from, it's a federal federally
Right.
data that
Well, it's data that
government-
Social Security has, Medicare and Medicaid, they have that. That's stuff that they're required to report before they pay them. So that's what, and the idea is that you get them from hospitals or labs or doctors, and all those people have to be registered. Okay, so that's all legitimate.
This is also not an NSA project.
Right, this was not NSA. Nothing in the intelligence community. Okay, so that's, that was the idea, and that works for any kind of data that you want to look at, phone calls or anything. So in the graph, in order to, this is how we filtered out data we wanted. If you had a set of known targets here, and you're building a social network for them in the world, I mean, then these are the targets, your known targets, then look out. We used a 2-degree principle. Look out 2 degrees, like that's 1 degree and 2 degrees from a known target. And that's the section of the graph that you would consider to be suspicious or need further investigation. So in other words, if you're collecting data, you would certainly take advantage of the ones that you know and simply forward that data and manage the distribution of that according to the requirements. And save the data here so that you could do some other things like latent semantic indexing and kind of comparison of the content of this set of targets against potential new targets here. And then the rest of this data, we use simply, that's the rest of the world, the other 6.5 billion or whatever it is people in the world, you simply throw that data away. So it makes a manageable set approach that makes all the content of the world kind of manageable to handle now. So you can then pass this data around and run it through different programs to select or not, and use it to identify perhaps this is a new target. You could help do target development using this approach also. So that was the whole key to that. And that's really what they're asking for in Big Data Initiative. They want you to automate the target development in this kind of a graph. That's one of the things they're asking for, I'm sure. If they don't know that, then they should, right? But this then, what you do is you take everything you have. Now, they're not restricting it. See, the problem is they're taking in all this data too, okay? Now what you do is you index all of the data that you collect against the specific nodes that are involved in this graph. So now when you want to, and this is where the profiling comes in, you want to look at a particular node, then you simply input that node and any other associated nodes with it into another program that does a timeline. It pulls together all those events and maps it, because it's indexed, to the graph, okay? Now that pulls that data together, so you represent, like these phone calls were made here with that call there, that one there, and so on. These are the activities of a community in that graph. Plus, if you have, for example, data that goes with it, like a transcribed phone call or an email or a file transfer or something of that nature, then you put a little block here and it says there's data with that particular transaction in this graph. So if you isolate a section of the graph you're interested in looking at potentially activity that might imply that group is doing something, and there's data with it, then you could look at that data and try to assess that in context with the transactions that occur in the group. So that's the way of trying to, and this is also what they need to automate, right, is what transaction combinations here in this group have some meaning. So in other words, what kind of action should I be taking if they show evidence of certain transactions and relationships in the community? For example, if you are in Colombia and you want to smuggle drugs into the United States to somebody in the United States who wants to buy them, the buyer and seller have to connect in some way, right? There has to be some financial transaction in some way. They have to arrange for transport. Those kinds of things show up as transactions in this timeline. And so you need to try to detect those and then assess them. Okay, so this is really what's going on with everyone. This is why I say everybody in the United States is profiled, because the data's in the base, it's indexed against the graph's made, and all they have to do is point to it to get it. Yes?
Is that real data?
This was, yes, it was. This was real data from our.
Evidence of illegal activity? 'Cause this
Yes.
is from 2001.
Yes, it is. This is the research we did online for the 9/11 attack. Okay, that
They own one of those phone numbers in
No, these are real phone numbers. We picked. Yeah, we picked them out. These were real phone numbers for the people and the phone calls they made, the emails they sent, and so on. We tried to make it as real as possible. We gave this briefing internally in CIA, and they said, "How do you know all this stuff?" Because at the same time, one of the emails had the date and time, or not the time, but the date, 9/11 as the attack date. That was given in one of them, in a pi line and a line and a pi. With a line for 9. And so, you know, this is where I see the danger. Now, if you become like generals in the Army, like Petraeus or Allen, and you become a target, I now look at your 1,000 emails or however many you have in the database, and there you are. The problem is the FBI has access to this data. Director Mueller testified to that in March of 2011 to the Senate Judiciary Committee. He testified that he set up a technology database with the Department of Defense. This was in response to a question, how would you prevent a future Fort Hood, that is a terrorist inside this country, killing people inside this country? He said, we set up this technology database where he can go in and make one query and get all past and all future emails as they come in on a target. So it says they're all stored, okay? So that's what's going on. That's what Bluffdale's all about. That's what that extension's all about, is to store more data about everybody in the country as well as everybody in the world. So, yeah.
I have one other question. You suggested that when you form the graph, you prune out some of the data you know might be extraneous by noting their relationships to others on the graph. Is that true?
Yes. What you do is you do frequency counting. You use that as a basis for validating combinations.
So does this pruning occur at the listening post, like say in AT&T?
Yes.
So if I broke into one of these rooms, I could figure out the people who are on that watch graph?
Yep. It also says that, gee, since one identifies anybody in the regional zone 1 of the world, that's the U.S., Canada, and some of the islands. It's right in your white pages book. If you look, it'll list out then after all that, the 1, there's all the area codes for everybody that's in there, Canada, United States, and so on. All they have to do is use that as a base of knowledge to go into their entire database and count all of the phone numbers there that have a 1 in them, right? And then the ones that are in the United States, and then they would have a count of how many Americans are in the database and how often each one's there. And yet they claim they can't do that, which is false. You do the same thing with email, with service providers and IPs and things like that, and MAC numbers, right? Combinations. So at any rate, that's unfortunately the state of our surveillance status is all set to be turned on for the imperial presidency to do whatever it wants to do. Now, the real kicker to me came after the raid that they did on us when they pointed guns at us and threatened us and tried to prosecute us with they falsified evidence. Well, the real kicker is they started to prosecute Tom Drake. I don't know if you heard of his case, but but they also falsified evidence there. That is, they took unclassified material that he had, claimed it was reclassified, or they did a review of it and claimed it was classified. So they classified unclassified material so they could charge him with having classified material. So the real problem was that, for them anyway, when you get so big, the right hand doesn't know what the left's doing. So Jim Bamford did a FOIA on all the charges that they listed, all the emails and papers that they listed in the charges against Tom. He did a FOIA to NSA for those papers, and they gave him some of them, unclassified. So he is a friend of the court, took it to Judge Bennett, who was hearing the case, and said, here are all the things that they're charging him with as classified, and they're giving to me as unclassified. So their entire case fell apart. because the judge now knew that they were fabricating evidence. In my mind, they should have been charged with a felony. Right? They were framing him. Just like they were trying to frame us, yes.
To what extent can we rely on that always being the case, the left hand is not going to know what the right hand is doing?
I think that's pretty much our government. Ed Loomis, who was my partner, he took Dr. Taggart's place. We always felt that Forrest Gump had it right. You know, stupid is as stupid does. That described our government. But the problem is that incompetence at that scale, when they're doing things on this scale, is really dangerous, because you could end up on a kill list without knowing what the criteria is to get there or what the criteria is to get off.
I'm assuming that.
Yeah. I figure I could be on it. So, so at any rate, yes.
Can you speculate as to whether any foreign intelligence agencies have compromised the database?
Have any compromised the database? Well, I thought Director Mueller did, right? In his testimony. He didn't know what he was saying, but he did that. He's one of my better sources, by the way.
I think
So-
a follow-up question is, are there any intelligence sharing agreements you have with, say, UK or Australia that might have given them access to these databases?
Okay, yes. I would say yes. It's called the Five Eyes Group, English-speaking countries. They're much closer than others, okay? There are other relationships around the world.
Could you talk about other similar systems that other nation-states might have, or networks of nation-states?
I really don't. I think they were depending on NSA to do it, okay? For example, the others that I knew of anyway were depending on them to do it. So I don't know of any others who were doing anything comparable, because their intelligence agencies are much smaller. They don't have the budgets, and so they're much more dependent. Yeah.
I read there was a big building data center in Utah. Does that tie into this at all?
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly it. The Bluffdale, by my calculations, the 100,000 square feet of the million square feet they have is going to be storage. And if you looked at cleversafe.com, they advertise 10 zettabytes in 200 square feet, which means you can get 10 exabytes in 200 square feet, which means you could get 5 zettabytes in the storage there, which is enough if you eliminated, by my estimate anyway, if you eliminate all the video going across the fiber optic lines and all the analog audio that you don't want, and simply pick up the the material you do want from the targets you have, plus all of the printed information. That's probably enough to store 100 years of the data of communications of the world. 5 zettabytes, 5 times 10 to the 21st bytes.
So what if you send your secret things disguised as a video? You do it as
Embedding?
rock bands, you know.
You mean embedding the material? Embedding it?
Well, if you're going to feel that way.
We were talking about this earlier. In my mind, the safest way to do it, no online cipher is safe. Simply because if they don't have the key, they'll come across and get it from you. Or that's assuming they didn't already implant it in your system. So the safest way is to do everything offline, encryption offline, then go online and send it, and do decryption offline. But you have to have an air gap there. If you don't have that air gap, you're not safe.
No, I was just thinking if you just did it as a rock video, so it got dismissed as a rock video.
That's embedding. That's not.
Video.
Yeah, but that's not safe. Yes.
I have a question. So, just to clarify, the data column over there, currently, are there transcriptions of all emails? Can they break advanced encryption standards?
You mean like 128 or 256, or?
Yeah.
I don't think they have to break them at all if they already have them. I mean, that's my point. you have back doors into you. It's not a question that no online system is safe.
What do you mean by backdoors? You mean they can just hack into your computer?
Right. Or they're required by law to put a back door into the system so that the FBI can listen to it. Yeah. Yes.
Could you say something about the content analysis of phone calls?
Well, I mean, content, my understanding is that it's basically like a Google search. They're using word search. So if you do a transcription, right, it gets transferred into a character, ASCII stream characters.
But I'm asking about to what degree is there automatic audio transcription going on?
Okay, all right, that's a different story. When I left, it wasn't possible. So I really have no further information on that. I've seen some of the things that look pretty good, you know, in which case that would be easy to apply, especially in a quiet environment, a non-noisy environment. Yeah. Yeah.
There was an article in 1980, I can't remember exactly, in the U.S. News and World Report, that NSA was doing surveillance of telephone calls, and the way they were doing it is it would be triggered by certain keywords. Some particular words would trigger recording, actually. That was in 1980s, and that was done by NSA. We're not talking about 9/11.
No.
An article, I read it almost 30 years ago.
Well, I can only say that sometimes they attribute more capability than exists to NSA. Okay? There were a lot of problems with that. I knew a lot of problems when I was there that weren't didn't make it too. It wasn't useful in an operational sense. Okay, there were too many mistakes. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of times we hear a lot of discussion that you can see the patterns and that'll tell us who the bad guys are. I mean, what you're presenting here is that they have lots of information, and gee, if they want to go after David Petraeus, or for that matter, Bill Binney, they can then turn the spotlight and get all the data, all of your data that they've collected. Is there a capability at this point that you're aware of or that you can foresee where by taking all of the data, suddenly it's going to tell you who the bad guys are? They're talking about predictive policing.
We already did that, okay? That's what we maintained was the way to do it. We had no problem making those decisions. They apparently still do. And the reason I thought was because they really wanted to spy on the United States. And they claim it as an excuse. We're still having trouble. We can't do it unless we can take in all this data. We won't be able to achieve that end. And that's simply false. Yeah. Yes?
If you are using offline end-to-end cryptography for email, is there any system that will highlight you as a suspicious person? Is there anything that looks for that?
Well, what it would mean, it would default out, like if they couldn't break it or they didn't have a key that would work.
Just
they would,
that somebody was doing that.
Yeah,
yes. Generally, they say that's very suspicious. That's what the FBI says. If you're encrypting, it's suspicious. You're already, that's tick number one for the hit list, okay? I don't know how many more ticks you have to add before you get on the list or what it takes to get off once you're on. I mean, after all, Senator Kennedy up here was on the no-fly list for so many months he had trouble getting off. Well, if he got on it and had trouble getting off, imagine what any one of us what the problems we would have. At any rate. So, yeah.
I wanted to follow up on your description of the encryption of Americans. So if the data about Americans was being collected, then you said there was a program in place to encrypt the attributes of Americans. So there's first of all, the legal question as to whether even collecting that information was legal. Putting that aside, a couple of questions I had was, one, would you imagine this was still being done, this encryption? And if so, what's the encryption philosophy? And why should that be effective? And we've seen cases where even using pseudonyms and things like this, and Tanya Sweeney has shown some of these things too, where privacy is in fact not protected by at least rudimentary forms of encryption because you can still find patterns and link things together. So I was wondering if you can say a little more about what kind of philosophy or justification for this approach might be.
First of all, I forgot about that because that was in place until 9/11, and after 9/11, they removed the protections of U.S. citizens. So there's nothing in there protecting any U.S. citizen. Secondly, I would say that I designed the encryption to protect U.S. citizens to resist mass attack. Okay. So it had 3 levels of encryption, one of which meant that any attempt they made, even if they had whatever key they applied or attempted to apply, however many trillions of keys, if they got something that looked like it was partial language, it would be an error. So that was by design. So I was designing it so NSA couldn't break into it. So
But sometimes the graph structure,
Yeah.
you used to relabel the nodes of a graph. The graph structure still makes it clear that there's, where somebody lives maybe or something, because
Yes.
all of their contacts are within New York or something like that. And so
Well,
encryption may not be enough to protect.
see, no, they wouldn't be able to make that determination. Okay, they couldn't say it was in New York or Massachusetts or anywhere because all that material was encrypted. So you couldn't. All you were doing was look. All the attributes that could identify anybody as a U.S. citizen would be encrypted, so that when they looked in, they couldn't tell who was who. I mean, if I went after you in this database, I couldn't. What am I looking for?
No, but the things that have been attacked, for example, if you're given a Facebook graph with everybody in it anonymous, you don't know who anybody is a priori, just from the structure of the graph, you can recover people's identities. That's the issue.
Yes.
Well, you'd have to have some way to break it down into subsets before you could start doing that kind of assessment, I think. That's the way I view that. I mean, you have to do the same thing with the phone network, which really, it would be random. I mean, when you're doing billions of combinations, I mean, any kind of...
So are you saying that it's not linkable? Your two different conversations that you've had cannot be linked to you. Cannot be linked to each other, so you cannot tell that it's the same person.
No, it would be uniquely encrypted, so you could pull together, like your name would be uniquely encrypted over time, the same encryption.
So then you can pull out the social
So you could,
graph, you just don't know who
right, and the reason to do that is to build probable cause if you're doing something that looks bad. And then that would be evidence for probable cause. You take it to a court to justify getting a warrant and then decrypting and targeting you, which was the procedure we wanted to set up.
But it's from the point of view of just statistics and what we know about social graphs, even that isn't particularly privacy conscious because you just from that graph.
Well, but see, you'd have to have a distributed graph to compare it to, which means you'd have to know what the graph is really to take this encryption and try to lay it over top of it.
But it would only take.
If you could get into it, yes.
So
That's right.
So if you're, the NSA equivalent of Britain, and you have a graph like that.
Yeah, that's different then.
Then they just
Yes.
they combine it with the
Well, I don't think Britain would care for these protections anyway, so. I think they're a little worse than we are, right? Yes.
So you said you had no problem detecting the bad guys.
Right.
From large amount of data. How do you tell the bad guys from a bunch of kids fooling around and pretending to be bad guys?
Well, starting with the relationships in the graph, how they would connect to these bad guys. That kind of, I mean, this is only one of a couple 100,000 of them that we know. So in the billions of people that we're graphing, right, they would have to show up in close proximity, and then if they weren't bad guys to begin with, then we'd have to look at them a little closer to see what they were doing. But they would be the ones we'd look at to try to develop new targets, not the rest of these innocent people doing absolutely nothing. We had other programs that would go through those innocent people relationships too to try to assess potential new targets, new communities. Yes?
Going back to what you said about crypto being backdoored, are you saying that the algorithms themselves are unsound, or are you saying that the popular implementations have flaws in the...
Yeah, I think it's the implementation. I mean, you could, if you take it offline and use your own key, set a new key, then certainly that should be secure. Or it would be difficult. I have no idea how long it would take to get into them. I work codes primarily, or data that was used to set things initially for ciphers, so to speak.
So you're saying that I shouldn't use OpenSSL?
Is it on the web? If it's on the web, don't. I would say this. I can only say the safest way to encrypt is offline with an air gap, so that you can't lose it, right? That it can't be penetrated. That's the only way to really be safe. Yep. Oh, sorry. Okay. I'll sit down.
Make our points, and we're going to open it back up for discussion.
Yeah.
There are plenty of more questions. Carol.
Great, thanks. Thanks, everybody. What a pleasure to be here. Yeah, indeed. Am I mic'd? Are we good to go? Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. How could I say no to an opportunity to be a respondent at all to Bill Binney, who's really one of the heroes in the civil rights and civil liberties community and the technology community, as somebody who stepped forward. And I'm so pleased that so many of you are here today, because your time will come at some point in your careers where you will have that opportunity also to decide how you want to deploy the incredible skills that you're developing here at MIT or in your work around the world. I wanted to open a couple of quick thoughts. One is, I think it's important that we distinguish between privacy and secrecy, and we're dealing with both of those things here. Privacy is really the ability to control information about yourself that goes out, that you have some control over what the information is. Secrecy is really what the government does a lot, which is to not let us know what they're doing in terms of some of these systems and what they're building around us. And they're really kind of turning our democracy on its head in a democracy where it's the job of the people to watch the government. Instead, we have the government watching the people in secret. And so we have this situation where the law really hasn't yet caught up, and the public policy really hasn't caught up yet with the incredible technology. And technology, I always think it's a little bit like money. It's not inherently good or inherently bad, but you can deploy it in ways that are good, and you can deploy it in ways that are not good in terms of defending civil rights and civil liberties, which is what I do. A couple of interesting ways that the secrecy problem is coming to the fore now in terms of trying to develop public policies that would protect people's privacy, the right to control information about ourselves. And one of the ways that that's happening is through the use of state secrets. So the courts are saying, you can't bring that case to court to litigate whether or not it's constitutional to do some of the things that are now going on, not the things that Bill's creating, but the other things where they aren't, where they're collecting data on everybody. And the courts are taking what was traditionally a rule of evidence, saying that piece of evidence is a secret, it's a state secret. You might exclude that piece of evidence or have it just the judge knows about it or somehow find protections, to now say the whole case is being kicked out. You can't bring the case at all. You cannot get into court to find out if it's constitutional or not to do that. And the other way is through the use of standing arguments, to say you don't have standing to be in court, that there's no case and controversy that affects you. And this just is coming up right now in a case that the American Civil Liberties Union just argued in the US Supreme Court on October 29th, so we'll see where it goes. A case called Clapper, Amnesty International versus Clapper. Amnesty International, along with a bunch of criminal defense attorneys and journalists, are the clients of the ACLU who are saying, we want to know if we're being subjected to this kind of warrantless wiretapping when we talk to our clients overseas, that we may be talking to a source if we're a journalist. We may be talking to a client if we're a lawyer. We may be talking to people whose rights have been violated if we're human rights documentation people. And we need to know. And the government's response is to say, well, you can't prove that we're actually wiretapping you. And if you can't prove it, then you don't have standing to bring the case. And we say, great, would you assure us that then our clients are not being wiretapped? And they say, no, we couldn't possibly confirm or deny whether they are or not. So it's this catch-22. And I always feel when I talk about this stuff, it's really not Orwell. It's not Big Brother. It's really Kafka. You just don't know why this is happening to you, because you can't even get into court to try to vindicate your rights. So this notion of privacy versus secrecy, I think, is an important one that we should keep in mind as we think about how to go forward. And the other piece of that, I talked a little bit about, I'm not a big conspiracy theorist. I'm not that worried about Big Brother. It's really Little Brother that freaks me out. I mean, imagine the people at the Registry of Motor Vehicles having control over your life. Okay, that's really scary, right? A lot of this technology, a lot of these techniques, a lot of the laws that pertain to it are now filtering down into the local level. So for example, we just came out with a report. We did a public information records request, and we found out the Boston Police Department have been spying on peace protesters. And actually the reports, at first we thought we didn't have anything. They were so silly. There was things like Howard Zinn. They wanted to get Matt Damon to speak at the peace group at the church. They couldn't. They're going to have to settle for Howard Zinn. It was hilarious stuff. And then labeled extremist, criminal threat, and put into a database. And in a database, under the key terms, extremists and terrorist threat and things like that. Okay? And then people, all these innocent people getting swept up in the database that then is used by local cops, local police departments getting access to these through these local fusion centers that are being built here in Massachusetts. We have two, one with the state police, one at the Boston Police Department, the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, and there's very little check and balance on it. Again, because it's done in secret. So thinking not only about the big picture, but then have this sort of trickle down, if you would, effect that we're now experiencing, which is where the ACLU and EPIC and Electronic Frontier Foundation, all these other groups are now beginning to turn their attention to try to get a handle on how can we put in some legal protections so that we can still have the benefit of the technology, but we also keep the freedoms and the liberties and the democracy that we all really like to enjoy in this country. How do we do that? Well, one way we can do that is to have more courageous people like Bill Binney. I worship you, thank you. And people like Bill Binney, Tom Drake, T. Kirk Wiebe, Martin Klein, the guy, the AT&T guy. These are people who are technologists. And when they saw something wrong, they didn't just go silent. They spoke up about it. They had the courage of their conviction. They knew right from wrong, and they knew that it was important that as technologists who understood what was happening, and that it didn't have to happen, that it technologically didn't have to happen. They were willing to come forward and talk about it. We need you. There will come a time in your life where that moment will arise for you, and you will have to, A, realize it, hopefully, and B, then decide what you want to do. If you're not sure, call the ACLU. We'll give you free legal advice, okay, about what to do, what your options are. How you should respond to it. Call us anyway. We need help with technologists. A really silly example of this. So when the Charlie card came in, you know, the Charlie card on the T, those of you who ride the T and you can swipe your card, we were said, wow, shouldn't there be a way to have an anonymous Charlie card so they can't track your location movements, like to buy your card with cash and do it with cash and not a credit card so that nobody can track where I'm going. And so we went over to meet with the MBTA and they said, oh, technologically, that's just not possible. I was so lucky. I was like in the Woody Allen movie where he pulls the guy out from behind the Marshall McLuhan out from behind the desk. I had my guy from MIT who was there, and I pulled him out. Robert, is that true? He said, no, that's nonsense. And it was nonsense, but it was so, I don't know, I'm not a technologist, I'm a lawyer. I needed a technologist who was there, who was willing to speak up, and who could call down those kinds of things to say we can't put in audits, or we have to take everybody's data, we can't encrypt and throw out the nonsense. We need technologists who are willing to help us to understand what's going on, to issue spot things that they see that are going on, and to help us and work with us. So if any of you, or hopefully all of you, are interested in helping, we really do want to work with you and work with the MIT community to do a better job of doing this. And next time I need to go talk to the MBTA, I can bring one of you along with me, and that would be really, really great. So if you are interested, let me know. There are also little slabs of paper, a piece of paper on your tables that talk about how you can get more involved. So the last things I want to say, and then I'll open it back up to you guys, and frankly back to Mr. Binney, because he's the real expert here. I wanted to say, get educated about this stuff. Know your rights, know the contours of it. I know you're incredibly educated about your technology, but also get educated about the public policy debates that are going on, because we really need your expertise to be brought to the public policy debate. And one way you can do that, we've built a website, privacysos.org, that has lots and lots of information about technology and surveillance technology and the policy debates. Get involved, whether it's with the ACLU or with the Electronic Frontier Foundation or the Electronic Privacy Information Center, or lots of other groups that are out there. We're all coalition partners. We work together. We play well together, fortunately. But we really need people to get involved and to sort of help us to be better at what we do in terms of understanding the technology. And the last thing I would just say is, when you leave here tonight, talk to 5 other people Talk to 5 other people about what you've learned, about what's going on, about how this is coming. And frankly, I don't think it's too late for us to take some steps to put in a system of checks and balances again, because we're not going to stop technology. I never say technology versus liberty. I always say technology for liberty. How can we use technology to create more liberty, a greater breathing space? Because after all, if we don't have that, all the safety in the world is really sort of not worth it if we're not free at the same time. And I think we can be both safe and free. So thank you, Mr. Binney. And thank you all for being here. And I look forward to more questions and conversation from everybody.
I should comment that this is being videotaped, so if you don't want to put your
That's right.
videotaped, they'll speak up.
Yes, it is being videotaped. I want you to know that. So if you have any questions, or I do want you to be aware of that. It is being videotaped, and it's going to be posted on the MIT website. We're going to open it up now for discussion. I thought it worked really well, having questions as we go, but I'm going to bring both Carol and Bill back up here. If you will agree to do that. And while they're coming up, I just want to remind you all that the basic presumption in the United States has been that everyone is innocent until proven guilty, but now we all know that that's been inverted, so that everyone is a suspect, that there is illegal, unconstitutional, warrantless collection of your information going on constantly, a violation of your Fourth Amendment protection, and the case against each of us is now being prepared. So I'm going to open it up for questions. Please put your hands up. Here are the rules. Put your hands up if you have an urgent question on the same matter. Even though you're not the next in line, you can put up 2 hands like this. Let's start with you back there, please.
Hi, my name is Shavani Red. I'm the former executive director of the TOR project. And I came into this particular area because my dad was an activist with the SCLC and Dr. King in civil rights eras. And when it became available for him to make a request for his records from the FBI from 1963 and so on, he got a paper box, a very large one. The FBI knew who he had lunch with every summer of the summer marches. So this is not new. It's just electronic. So, you know, the idea that this is being collected is not new. It's been going on for, you know, a century, at least. And, but one of the things that being executive director of TOR did was, you know, my family has steward leadership traditions, both in the military and governmental and in, you know, activist circles for over a century. And I got to talk to a lot of people working on the agency side of things. And when the Patriot Act went through, the people working in the agencies, there were all these things in the Patriot Act. And if the people who wanted to respect, they can't talk about it, but the people who wanted to respect the civil rights and civil liberties things, if they wanted to not take advantage of the things in their casework, in those acts, in CALEA, in all of these things, they would be trampled for every promotion and everything else in their work. And they would be left behind, and there would be no people with those attitudes in the higher levels of any of those agencies. This happens in diplomatic circles, in the Bush administration. This is happening in every branch of DHS. And so understanding that about what's happening in DHS right now, that even the people who believe in these rights very, very much are forced into compromising their integrity and going along with them to prevent them from being locked out.
They're being threatened and intimidated.
Right. And they have to compromise what they do in their work. To, you know, it is a really important thing for people to understand that the people in those agencies are not all jerks, even if they're going along with these regulations. And I just think that's important to say, because literally they can't say that as members of those agencies. They can't complain.
Right.
They're prevented from talking about it.
Yeah, of the about, for example, in NSA, of the about 40,000 people there, the space they have allocated for this program, Stellar Wind, is only about, would only hold about 100 people.
Mm-hmm.
So of that 40,000, 100 are involved in this activity. Actually, it was kept very quiet. They they subverted the constitutional process by limiting access and knowledge of this program to like 4 people in Congress to begin with. Mm-hmm. On the House side, that was Portagas and Nancy Pelosi, mm-hmm. and Senate was Graham and somebody else I can't remember. Mm-hmm. Just the chiefs and ranking members of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. Now, Rockefeller later in 2003 said when he got his brief, when he was the chief, right, or deputy, whichever it was, he said he had no way of validating or following this or monitoring it. He just was not a technician, not a lawyer. He couldn't do anything. So what they did was they made Congress impotent, and they never even told the courts. So they subverted our entire constitutional process.
If you use the diplomatic corps as an example, during the Bush administration, a lot of people kind of held on by their fingernails, hoping that there would be a turnaround, and there were career diplomats who just sort of gritted their teeth for 8 years and really hoped that they would just be able to like swallow their bile for 8 years, and things got a little better.
But it doesn't seem to make any difference with any party. I mean, it's still going on. It's getting worse.
Not partisan.
Yeah, it's getting worse. But the thing is that what happens is that there are a lot of people in this room, I think, who are thinking, God, I could never go work for the government. And the best way to change some of these things may be, in fact, for there to be an insurgent invasion.
Infiltration.
An infiltration.
An
infiltration. Yeah. My son is right now at Norwich University as an officer candidate. Okay, and I am former executive of the Support Project. And that was his idea. After, TOR came out of a military project originally, and he looked at people I was working with on all sides of the problem. And he sat there and said, you know what, if people of this sort of viewpoint all sit there and say, no, we're not going to, none of our children are going to go into law enforcement or the military, then only jerks are going to go into those fields.
Yep.
And that's democracy.
Yeah, but it is bad. But also think about the guy who's the AT&T technician, who came forward and spoke. So it's not just about people in the military. I think whatever platform you're on, whether it's a teaching platform, whether it's a student platform, whatever platform you're working on, you can turn that to be a force for good. And you'll know when that moment comes that you say, yeah, it may be a trade-off between my current employment and not, and maybe you can't make that trade-off. And I wouldn't dare to presume that people can, or that they even should. You will have to make a decision of conscience when that moment comes.
Someone here, someone there, and this fellow. Please, this gentleman behind you, actually. Did you still have a question?
Yeah, so it's always been my understanding first that the outside of NSA community runs about 10 to 20 years behind the NSA in encryption technology. I'm curious if that gap is getting bigger or smaller. And then part two that very specifically relates in my mind to, you said that they're holding the ability to hold 100 years worth of data, which has historically been, well, if I can't break it today, I can always go back and look at it tomorrow.
That's right. Yeah.
So would you have comments on the first A and then the utility of B?
Well, I can only give you my guess. I think that the gap is closing between what's external to NSA and what NSA has.
You think we're catching up?
I think so. That's my impression, okay? I may be wrong. I don't know.
Through sharing or capability?
More in terms of, I'm thinking more in terms of capability. So.
Right, I mean, I forget, I think linear cryptanalysis was 15 years behind the NSA,
right.
maybe 20, but a large number.
Right, but I think that's shrinking.
So Do you think we might be less than 15 years behind on quantum computing, for instance?
That's a solved problem. Sorry. Yes. Mathematically anyway, right?
Back there?
Hi, I'm Sasha Costanza-Chuck. I'm an assistant professor of civic media here at MIT. I just started last year. It's really easy for all of us to agree that the application of these systems and tools for domestic purposes is problematic, but I wonder if both of you could also talk a little bit about their application internationally. So we could use the drone assassination program as one example. The recent report that came out that, documenting civilian casualties, the deniability by the administration. I mean, at the end of the day, it's very nice to be able to say, well, let's limit this thing so that we're only turning it on quote-unquote the bad guys, but come on, really.
This is information collection. Drones are not precision weapons. Right? They have a kill radius that's beyond the target. And that's what you're talking about. I call that undisciplined slaughter.
What I'm talking about is the real-world application of these systems ultimately involves, quote-unquote collateral damage. So could we talk about that a little bit?
Well, from my sense, from the graphing that we were doing, we had the capability to protect everyone in the world. In other words, all that blue data that we threw away included everybody in the world. So we, in effect, were, in a sense, protecting everyone. If you had no proximity to somebody who was known to be doing something bad, then all your data was thrown away.
Well, and
so,
also add,
that's one way we were trying to do that. Is that kind of getting at what you're
really. What I'm saying is that all of us have associations with people who, depending on the legal regime at the moment and how it's being observed and implemented, have association with someone who's known to be doing something bad. So I'm questioning the actual development of
the bad guy list
system in terms of real world application. It always has these type of consequences.
Yes, and that's still from my my sense is that it's not as disciplined as it should be, right? I mean, I know some of the people who are still there. I mean, I don't think they're really applying rigorous rules and rigorous analysis of what's going on to make that list up. So I would question a kill list to even begin with too. I mean, that's kind of an extreme that you really have to know what you're doing, and you have to really use precision weapons, and they're not doing that. Not doing either of it. So I just don't trust. I'm against all kill lists.
Me too. But also, and the ACLU actually litigated unsuccessfully and tried to get just the policy with regard to what is the standard for the getting on the kill list for the use of drones. And again, it was the state secrets argument that kept us out of court from even getting to be able to get our merits of our case heard in the court. So going back to attacking secrecy is one of the really fundamental things we have to do is important. And the other thing I just wanted to raise, and it's a little bit a tangent from what you're raising, is a lot of these systems, a lot of the things that we do, we test in other contexts. So for example, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, there's a lot of biofacial recognition technology being put in, creating a huge database on every human being in the whole country, just creating a database for the sake of doing that. Okay, that's what they wanted to do, and they justified it because they were doing it in the context of a war zone. Well, now what we're seeing with the wars winding down, a lot of people are coming back. In our very own city of Springfield, here in Massachusetts, it's becoming a little test for using counterinsurgency techniques as policing techniques, because we have a couple of police officers who've come back, and they're so excited about that, and they decided to try to use some of the same techniques and develop that as a new policing technique. So one of the things that we're trying to take a look at is this sort of federalization or localization, if you would, and militarization of local policing. That's going on, and it includes the shared database stuff, and it also includes some of these other techniques that are actually being developed in other countries where you can do it because you have fewer legal constraints to do it, and then they import it back here. So it's something to pay attention to.
There's a question right there.
Oh, yeah. So, no, I just wanted to say that because I felt bad for the, thousands of people who spend their careers in the government who actually are the good guys. It's not fair to say, oh, we need to infiltrate the government. Actually, the government already has people who are committed to civil liberties, and isn't actually the ACLU, owing to the ACLU, the USA Patriot Act, so not the one immediately after September 11th, but the next one, actually includes a provision that there be a civil liberties officer working at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, making sure that our constitutional rights are not violated. Now, whether the system is working properly, of course, depends on who is president. But I think the point is that it's not, I don't know, I think that compared to other countries, such as the Soviet Union, which is where I was born, I think, it's too early to lose hope.
Yeah, I thought the KGB would love this kind of system, yeah.
Actually, Bill said his first posting early on in his career was in Eastern Europe or in Europe, surveilling the Soviets and keeping track of the nuclear threat there. You have the next question.
So over the weekend, I think on NPR, as a result of, they're talking about the Petraeus and Allen thing, and it was speculated by one of the commentators that perhaps one of the good things to come out of this is that other public figures, particularly those in Congress,
they're all in it.
Might wonder when the machinery is going to be targeted at them, and maybe there's some hope that they'll rein it in.
Well, I think internally some of it already has been. Like one of the reasons Speaker Pelosi said in the floor of the House that impeachment of George Bush was off the table was because of the leverage that George Bush had, since she was one of the members of Congress briefed initially on the program. She was already culpable in that program, also the CIA programs. So she couldn't impeach him without impeaching herself.
I have,
Okay.
yes, and this gentleman next, please.
Yeah, I have a point of clarification. We've been talking about the FISA Amendments Act, which is now due for reauthorization, as if that is the real problem, namely that the communications between Americans and the external world are being captured. But what you're saying is that all communications are being captured.
That's right.
So why are we talking about the FISA Amendments Act? I mean, it seems
Well,
to
it
be a
doesn't.
red herring.
Yeah, or they have a separate secret interpretation. I mean, that's the problem with our government. It's going secret on us, so that the laws they write, they make their own interpretations internally and apply them, so that we have no way of knowing what they're doing.
Okay, we have a two-handed wave here. Go ahead.
My question is basically, jumping off that, is there some sort of boundary that protects this warrantless surveillance from entering a courtroom? I mean, you said that it's used to gain probable cause to look at people's emails, but is that just through FISA warrants, or can that actually be used in domestic prosecutions that don't have to do with terrorism?
Well, okay, take my case, the warrantless wiretap they had on me and a conversation I had with Diane Rourke. They put that in the affidavit and said in the affidavit that I told them about that conversation. So that's the way they entered it.
So they just lie.
Yeah, right. That's right. They lie. That's the FBI for you.
I was wondering where you see this all in 5 or 10 years, given now diffusion centers and information that's coming out of that could potentially flow to this. Where do you see all this going? 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What do you...
Well, I've said in a number of forums that it's going to be a totalitarian state, that we'll have an imperial president and a dictator. Unless we do something, unless people stand up. I mean, everybody in Congress took an oath to defend the Constitution. They're all violating that oath. So every time you see one, you'll say, what are you doing with this privacy stuff? You're violating your oath by supporting this kind of activity. Say it to them, bring it out. I'm trying to encourage, people, publishers, I just talked to one today, to throw it right in their face and say, what is your position on this? And put them on the record in public.
And I think it's important to realize, things like, there was no environmental movement really as a movement as such before 1970, and then we had Earth Day, and then there became sort of a movement. There needs to be a privacy movement. There really needs to be a privacy movement, not in the sense of we want to keep everything secret, but that we should have control over the information about ourselves that's out there and that's obtainable. We should have that system of checks and balances. It's very traditional conservative. I always love to say I work at the ACLU, most conservative organization in the world. We're all about the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and checks and balances. But we need you all to step forward, all people, to contact, take actions. There's more ways you can take action than you could ever imagine. Take action, send emails, let your voice be heard, talk to 5 other people about it. We need to create a movement for it, because until we change the situation on the ground, it's not like we can just go to the courts and vindicate this. We need a bigger movement. It has to be the courts. It has to be the groundswell. It has to be communications. There are people working on this, lots of them, but not enough. And we need more. And every time there's a scandal, I mean, I love this Petraeus thing. I mean, it's just great. Who knew that, chief spy couldn't keep his illicit sex life secret, right? You just love that. But it's an opportunity to make some change. So every time something like that happens, we have to take advantage of it. We have to be ready to go. And that means we all need to be educated and articulate and able to speak about it, and especially you as technologists. We really need your voice out there. You can't just be neutral, really. We need you.
Yeah, as citizens of this country, it really boils down to this. What kind of country do you want? What do you want to live? What kind of country do you want to live in? What kind of country you want your children and their children to live in? That's what's at stake here.
So I have this fellow next, someone over here, and someone in the back. Please.
I was wondering how much of the threat are private databases, surveillance systems, political information collection systems, credit card surveillance, et cetera, vis-a-vis the government.
Right. I can answer that, but why don't you take it, because you're the real expert.
Well, I mean, credit card stuff is financial transactions. That's who you're doing, who you're dealing with money-wise. And the standard used to be if Treasury dealt with an international or internal transaction of $10,000 or more, that they had to report that on a list, and that was reported with the 9/11 crowd. They transferred $65,000 to the people to Ata in Florida to do flight training, right? So that was reported when he did that. I mean, and that's one of the reasons they do that. They have that requirement, but they simply don't analyze things properly or pay attention or whatever, So, but this is now getting back into all the financial transactions of U.S. citizens, and I believe Elliot Spitzer, for example, was caught up in some of that. And that's what can happen to people, right? If you fall out of grace with the administration or whatever, that kind of targeting can occur.
One of the public policy reforms that we'd like to see, or legal reforms, would be to go more toward the European system of privacy, where you as a person own the information about yourself, okay? You actually have control. In this country, your internet service provider owns the information about your internet service actions. Your banker owns that. Your doctor owns that. The only exception is your video retailer, which doesn't exist anymore. But the only exception was because when Robert Bork was put up for the Supreme Court and they got his videotapes, they were so horrified that it had happened to them, they made a special exception, the Bork exception. So if you can do it to a Supreme Court justice, you can get some protection, right? But part of it is to change that. In Europe, you own the information about yourself. And so if the government wants to access it, they have to get your permission. Here, they don't. So with the national security letters under the FISA courts, they go and they put it, for a long time there was a gag on it. And now again, we have, son of national security letter. 2 years ago, they passed a law here in Massachusetts that now county prosecutors can go and get, without a warrant, and get information about your records, like your internet records and stuff like that, without a showing. And when we try to challenge it, they go into secret court session and they lock the doors on the ACLU lawyers.
Yep.
It's wild stuff. So we need to change that third-party doctrine. Is some of the kind of work and reform work that we could do that I think could make a big difference here.
I was actually thinking of something much more mundane. An entity like Walmart having political surveillance and knowing kind of the voting proclivities of potential job applicants and just simply ruling out anyone who votes, say, Democratic. I mean, is there any of that sort of stuff?
I think you'd have a strong, if you could prove it, I think you'd have a strong viewpoint discrimination claim.
Yeah, but is any of that stuff being done, do we think?
You mean if you would park in the lot and you have an Obama sticker, you would?
Well, there's that too.
I mean, companies do a lot of their own surveillance. Target, for example, is obsessed with surveillance. They have their own fusion centers nationwide where they monitor cameras from all of their stores. They do insane amounts of data collection. There was a story in the New York Times not too long ago about how they data mine their customers' information to the degree that they've figured out when women are pregnant, and they can send them information about Pampers discounts on baby wipes and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, it happens for sure.
I'm just going to comment though, because I was saying to our speakers tonight that, in talking to people in the last few days over this, several people said to me, well, you know what? Our government's doing it, Google does it, Target does it, why should I get upset? So, what Google and Target are doing, I don't like either, but those are corporations. If you don't like it, you can not shop there, you can, not participate. If you're a shareholder, you can go and protest. Very important to remember, and there's, what they're doing, things need to be done about it, and I and Carol and others work on that. But we are our government. Right? Our government is the emanation of us. So what's going on now, we are doing to ourselves. So it's important to keep that in mind.
Well, plus the government can come point some guns at you.
Right,
Yeah,
lock you up.
That too.
No.
That too.
In these discussions, the word unconstitutional gets used a lot, but the Constitution is old and vague, especially when it comes to privacy. And generally, this is set based on legal precedent and interpretations of the Fourth and Ninth Amendment. So I was wondering if you guys could speak just a little bit on that and how you see the precedent moving and what sort of clarity would be especially helpful in privacy, because the Constitution is vague.
I don't see the Constitution as vague at all. I mean, email is mail. Okay, and papers, that's
but
papers.
That has to be determined
so that's
precedent, right? Because it's old. So
well, I mean, there's been several.
Well,
it still applies. Bruce Fein would have an argument with that, so for sure.
I think there's a little bit of space here, and let me say why in a couple things. One is I just read the transcript of the Amnesty International versus Clapper case, the ACLU case that was just argued, and it was really interesting because, the Solicitor General, Don Varela, he opens and he says, Your Honor, may it please the court, and Sotomayor goes, who would have the ability to have standing here then, huh? I was like, wow, he didn't even get a word out before she jumped on it. Yes. And she also, I would say, in the Jones case, which was the case about whether or not you could put a GPS device on your, the cops can put a GPS device on your car and then follow it. She wrote a concurring opinion that suggests that there could be a more breathing space, that somehow the law needs to catch up with these new technologies. I would also just add, however, that particular case was another one where I think the privacy advocates won on that one because they kept saying, we could put this on your car, Your Honor. And they were horrified that it could happen to them. And so we need to, on all these things, find a way to make the argument that it could happen to you, Your Honor, because we seem to be able to win more when we do that. But I think it's hard. I think the Fourth Amendment has been very weakened by the way it's been interpreted, but I do think that there are some opportunities here, a little bit of daylight with this GPS, the Jones case from last year that gives us some hope that we may be able to go forward.
Okay, I have a gentleman in the back who's waiting for a while, and I'll take you. Go ahead, please.
I was wondering, you say the data on only bad people was used and everything else was thrown away or encrypted, but what is the what are the requirements for being bad? Like if I email my friend saying the party next week is going to be the bomb,
conceivably that could happen. No, that was with the system we did, okay? After 9/11, that system was done away with. So everything is now stored. So it doesn't matter now if you say bomb or not. You're stored.
I just wanted to know, in the Jones case, somebody had the concurring opinion, and it was only one vote. She was the only one who took that line. Everyone else seems to be holding pretty closely to Cats v. United States.
Yep.
So I'm wondering if you see any hope for Sotomayor's line, even though the majority of the court seems so set on that side.
Gramsci, I think, was the one who said you have pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the heart. So yeah, I keep hope alive. We keep trying to find new ways to frame cases, to frame challenges. I thought they were going to throw out this Clapper case on standing, and then you read the oral arguments, and it looks like maybe they're really interested in it. But you don't know. It's just really hard. Until they rule on it, we won't know. It's hard to be real optimistic with this particular Supreme Court and civil liberties, but on some of the issues like privacy and speech, there seems to be a little bit more breathing room than when you come to things like equality and race and things like that.
Okay, I have two last questions, please.
Could we say something about cell phone tracking? In particular, we've been talking a little bit about GPS and so forth, but most of us do carry cell phones, and my understanding is that even with them turned off, that your movements can be tracked by your movement through the different cell phone cells. Could you say something about that?
I think there's still enough radiation to be detected by the towers, the different towers, and you could be followed by which tower you get registered with. As you move around, you simply, any number of towers, you draw concentric circles around in the intersecting areas where you are. So as you move around, yeah, I think that's possible, yeah.
And we're actually working on a legislative initiative, actually, this one right here, is helping to do that both here in Massachusetts and also at the federal level to try to put some restrictions on cell phone tracking. Actually, Ed Markey, who's a congressman from Massachusetts, has been pretty good on this. And so there's a lot of legislative movement to try to put restrictions on that, as well as license plate scanners and sort of individual technology elements of it, because I think it's a really important thing for a lot of people to know that they don't have to make a choice between the convenience of a cell phone and giving away all their privacy. So it's a great question.
The last question.
How much discretion would you say that telecom companies, if any, have in refusing to comply with the government's requests?
Well, the CEO of Quest, refused, and of course he was denied, and eventually got charged with something. They drummed something up on him, but they lost any potential contracts with NSA. Quest did. So that was the penalty for not going along. The other companies went along. At least the ones in the CNET news article that published their interrogation of the different telecoms that were they participating with NSA or not, it looked like most of them were, the way they answered it. You see, if they equivocated, didn't come out and say strictly no, then you knew that they were participating, because it's the way they weasel word the answer. And that's why they all needed to get retroactive immunity, because all of these transactions they were doing were crimes.
That's right. And one last thing I would just say, Twitter has actually been very good in a lot of ways on a corporate perspective, because one of the things that happens is when they receive these requests for information, and it comes usually with a request that they don't tell the person whose account they're trying to get information on, Twitter will tell the person that your account or your information, your personal data has been subpoenaed, and that gives the person an opportunity to try to go into court. And we've had a couple of those. Unfortunately, what the courts usually say is you don't have standing, so we're back to that argument, because you don't own your data about yourself. But it's still an interesting thing, and I think that Twitter, as a corporate citizen, if you would, has actually been pretty good on that. And so if you have an opportunity to tell them thank you and to tell them that that matters to you, and that's one of the reasons you'd be willing to be a customer of their technology, you can do it. There are choices that we make, and they're sometimes really hard choices. I think Bill Binney and other people have made some really hard choices, but I think it's a really patriotic thing to do, and that's why I think it's such a wonderful thing that you're honoring him, and I'll turn it back to you.
Oh, thanks.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, again, I want to echo what Carol Rose said. Please tell the next 5 people you meet about this. Please also go on the website of your congressmen and representatives, get their email, just email them. It's fast and easy. You can send them the same message. For additional resources, there's the ACLU website. There's also, Carol mentioned, the Electronic Privacy Information, epic.org website. I want to particularly thank Ron Revest, who's been sitting here modestly in the front, and the Cryptography and Information Security Group at MIT for hosting this. So thank you very much, Ron, and thank you to that CIS group. And please join me in thanking Carol Rose and Bill Binney for their comments.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.